Okay, so welcome back. As always, we want to keep relating the material in terms of these pathways going into and out of the central nervous system, and these last talks are about that big in-between step. So here we're going to talk about cortical areas, processing sensory information in the posterior regions and anterior regions involved in formulating and sending out a plan of action for motor movements. First, about those regions of the brain that processes, makes sense of, and really, if you think about, creates your perception of the external world. That path begins as sensory stimuli is picked up by the many different kinds of receptors interacting with the environment. Some detect mechanical stimuli, such as pressure or different kinds of sensations on your skin, or sound waves picked up by these complex auditory structures. Others are chemical receptors that pick up things such as smell and taste, or photoreceptors located on the back of your eyeball that pick up light waves. So all these physical and chemical stimuli are ultimately transduced into electric signals. And that's what you have going through your brain, electric signals and synaptic communication bouncing around in your brain, and somehow out of all that you get consciousness. That will be explained in lecture 14.5c, or never. So all this sensory information first comes into the central nervous system and is routed to a particular region of the brain that will process and make sense of it. Here, we're going to look at the centers that are responsible for receiving some of the primary sense data coming into your body. The occipital lobe receives information from the thalamus, which received it from the optic nerve. The left and right occipital cortex receives information from the right and left visual field, respectively. We have not gone over the fact that information coming from one side of your body is processed in the brain hemisphere of the opposite side. For visual information, the left occipital lobe is receiving information from the right visual field, not just the right eyeball. I'm not going to get into that here, but if you're interested, you can ask me about it. So the so-called primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe is receiving visual information in the form of patterns of electrical activity and starting to make sense of what is happening in the visual field. The temporal lobe is the location of the primary auditory cortex, receiving information initially picked up by that hearing apparatus that converted sound waves into electric signals. Then deeper inside the temporal lobe is the olfactory cortex, which interprets the sense of smell. Within the parietal lobe, and in particular just posterior to the central sulcus, is the location of the primary somatosensory cortex. Somatosensory means information that is picked up from all those different touch, temperature, pain, etc. receptors embedded within your skin. Afferent fibers, and then the fibers within the ascending tracts, bring information from all over the body through the thalamus and are routed to the somatosensory cortex. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into how your nervous system forms maps of your body and the brain, but basically every region of your body is represented in a specific location of this primary somatosensory cortex. It is really a map of all those receptors embedded within your skin. If a neurosurgeon were to stimulate the neurons of the somatosensory cortex devoted to interpreting sensory information from your hand, you would subjectively experience it as something pressing on your hand. This map of your body within the primary somatosensory cortex is referred to as the sensory homunculus. The distortion of body parts evident here are because the density of receptors in those locations, and so you have more neurons devoted to analyzing sensation from your hands and your lips and your tongue than you do on your, say, the skin of your back. I could spend an entire class on how the homunculus, but that's all I'm going to say here. We'll get back to the homunculus when we start talking about the motor homunculus. So those are the areas of the brain receiving primary sensory information, and that is where the first analysis of that information is occurring. In each of the lobes, the area surrounding them is devoted to further processing that information and making more sense out of it. Really here, building a picture of the world at this point from primary sensory data. So these areas just adjacent to the primary cortices are called association cortices. These are higher order processing areas which can get very complicated. So I'll talk about one of them that incorporates all these different sensory inputs. At the intersection of these different sensory modalities is an area called Warnocks area that is involved in speech processing and understanding language. This is interesting because the concept of language draws on visual, auditory, and tactile information, but it's also much more abstract than any one by itself. So that's one of the highest functions of these association areas and way beyond the scope of this class in the 10-minute video. But just remember that this area is the area of the brain responsible for understanding language. So the brain areas receiving sensory data and going on to construct and interpret a picture of your external environment are located in those posterior lobes, the occipital, temporal, and parietal. The primary somatosensory cortex is located on the post-central gyrus, so named for the gyrus that is posterior to the central sulcus. And now we're going to move anterior to that central sulcus to the precentral gyrus. That is the location of the primary motor cortex, and neurons there send their long axons descending through the brainstem and spinal cord to synapse with the motor neurons that are responsible for controlling the skeletal muscles that move your body. Again, the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body and vice versa. That precentral gyrus also has a map of the body, the motor homunculus. The neurons in each of these areas of the precentral gyrus are responsible for controlling that part of the body. If a neurosurgeon were to stimulate the group of cells that represent your finger in the precentral gyrus, your fingers would move. The distortion of body size on the motor homunculus means that you have more neurons devoted to controlling your hands and your lips and your tongue than you do your back muscles. The primary motor cortex is actually the final stage of motor processing before it gets sent down to the spinal cord to carry out the commands. The premotor cortex, just anterior to the primary motor cortex, is responsible for formulating all the movements before sending it to the primary motor cortex. So this is a higher order association cortex performing more complex functions. And I'll talk about a particular area involved in motor movement called Broca's area. This area is formulating plans that will control how you generate speech. Now this involves more than just control of your throat, mouth, tongue muscles, because this area would also be involved if you are using sign language with your hand. So it's a very abstract, high-level processing area in the frontal lobe. And we're going to finish off the next lectures talking about the rest of those frontal lobe areas that are doing more long-range planning at the highest level processing of all. That is the prefrontal cortex and its so-called executive function. But also go back to a certain subcortical system that has a powerful and contentious relationship with that prefrontal cortex. We'll see you next time.